I just thought maybe you might have some flyers. Okay. Mark, last name is Manuel. 608-516-5178. Yeah. No, that's good. Like I said, I actually just thought maybe you might be so I could read
Well, good afternoon.
those. Okay.
The name is Bickerdike. This is Mary Ann Bickerdike.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much.
To my brave soldiers in blue, I was always known as Mother Bickerdike. Well, I was born up in Ohio, in Knox County, Ohio, up by Mount Vernon. My father, William Ball, why, he had a farm up there. Don't remember my ma at all. You see, my ma died when I was just about 18 months old. She died in a cooking fire. My pa, why, he didn't know what quite to do with that little girl, Mary Ann. He handed me over to my grandparents. They did everything they could for me. Oh, my pa then, he decided that he was going to start up another family. He married, had a few more children, moved on to Kentucky. Seems like just wasn't enough room in that family for little Mary Ann. But as I say, my grandparents, they did everything they could for me. They cared for me, they educated me, sent me off to school. Up there in Knox County, there was a ladies' seminary, it was called. And this here ladies' seminary up in Ohio, why, they were doing something very peculiar. They were training nurses. They were training women to be nurses, trained professional nurses. I latched onto that. Ever since I was just a little child, I always felt at my very best if I was looking after someone when they needed me. Even when I was a little girl, I used to think, if I'd been there to help my ma, maybe I could have saved her. My grandmother once told me that my poor ma took about 3 days to die. I always dreamt of that, if I'd only been there to help her out. Well, as I was saying, I became a trained nurse up there in Knox County. Came back to my grandparents' farm and, well, I set myself up as a midwife. Oh, I loved it. I loved every moment of it. Having those brand new babies, looking after the mamas. I was at my very best. Well, pretty soon, I was in my early 30s. I was 34, as a matter of fact, when I met a gentleman by the name of William Bickerdike. He was a sign painter. Well, he was looking for some company. We married. Mr. Bickerdike and I would have 4 children. We had 2 little girls. They didn't live long. The first one, just a matter of days. Second one never even saw her first birthday. But my boys, my 2 boys, they were sturdy and hardy babies, and they grew up to be good, hardy, strong men. Mr. Bickerdike, he, as I say, was a sign painter. And we were living up there in Ohio, and he decided that we should go to Kentucky to set up some business down there. And we stayed in Kentucky for a bit, and then we went up to Indiana. Then we went over to Illinois. Then we went all the way to Iowa. And then back to Illinois. It seemed you couldn't settle that man in one place. He always said, well, you've got to travel where the business goes. It always seemed with William the business was always going somewhere else. Well, we finally settled down there in Galesburg. Now, at that time, Galesburg was really blooming. It was getting all sorts of folks living there and businesses along the streets. So William did have a good business down there, painting signs for all the new shops and livery stable and so on. As I say, my boys were doing well. They were growing up, and sometimes they were working on other farms to bring in a little cash. Meanwhile, I was busy with those babies and those mamas. And I also cared for folks when they were sick with fevers, whatever. You see, back in those days when you were doing nursing, you came and you stayed right there with the family. But your duties were more than just nursing that sick person or that new mama and baby. Why, you were expected to keep the house clean, wash the family's clothes, cook the meals, and look after the other children, chop wood, milk the cow. Whatever was necessary, you were expected to do it. But I loved my work every day, every hour of it. Well, as I was saying, we were settled in pretty well there in Galesburg. My boys were growing up. And one summer, why, we got word that some of the neighboring counties had been seeing yellow fever moving through. That's like trying to stop a flood with a sieve. Can't do it. We knew that it would be flooding into Galesburg any day. I got word that one of the families about 3 or 4 miles out of town, why, they were suffering from the yellow fever. I packed up my medicines, packed up what food I could scrape together, and I rode on out to the farm. They were in desperate shape by then. They'd already buried 2 members of the family. The mama was very, very sick. I wasn't able to save her. Kept the children and the papa alive. I remember I was out chopping wood that day. Ryder came up, called out, Mrs. Bickerdike, you're needed back in town. Your husband, Billy, is taken sick with this yellow fever. Well, I threw my meager belongings together and rode back into town with him. I was too late. My Billy had died from the yellow fever. He was laid to rest down there in Galesburg. My boys, they were working on a farm, bringing in a little cash, and well, I had to scrape by as I could. He left me some debts. I paid those off. But in order to survive, I had to, in addition to my nursing, I cleaned people's houses and did the washing, looked after children, and still was delivering those babies. Seemed like there was always a new baby coming into Galesburg. I'd always been a good Christian woman, always attended the church meeting. But by this time in my life, why, the news kept coming to Galesburg. about that Civil War that had started up. More and more young men were leaving Galesburg to join up. I knew it was just a matter of time before my two boys would be called upon. Well, I was concerned about what would happen to my boys, needless to say. But I did not know the extent of pain and suffering those poor soldiers would endure. It was in the springtime. It was right after a big battle down there in Shiloh, Tennessee. And all the papers and all the folks coming through town were bringing word about what happened down there in Shiloh. A few weeks later, when I was coming back late at night from delivering a baby, I saw this piece of paper had been tacked to one of the fences coming into town. It said on the following Sunday there would be a minister, a ordained minister there at the Methodist Church in Galesburg. In addition to being an ordained minister, he was also a trained medical doctor. And he'd been giving medical care to the Union troops. He'd been down there in Shiloh. He was going to speak at the church. Well, that Sunday afternoon, I went to that church and I listened to him. By the time I was walking out that door, my heart was breaking. He described the suffering. He described the deprivation, the starvation that our soldiers were subjected to. Well, I got home that night, and I paced the floor. And by dawn's light, I said to myself, Mary Ann Bickerdike, you have nothing holding you here to Galesburg. Your boys are gone. Billy's long dead, buried there in the yard next to the church. You've got nothing here. But you do have something out there. You have the knowledge to help those poor men, those poor, suffering soldiers, those uncommon, common soldiers in blue. Next morning there, I packed myself up and I went down to the powers that be there in Galesburg, the mayor and so forth, and I presented to them a plan that I had. I said if they'd been willing to get a wagon for me, a couple of sturdy horses, and fill that wagon with food and supplies and medicine, well, I'd go down and I'd begin to nurse those soldiers. They needed all the help they could get. They were suffering. I was surprised. For in no time at all, the very next morning, the mayor came to my house and he said, Mrs. Bickerdike, we've taken up collections. We have a brand new wagon for you, 2 sturdy horses. The wagon is filled with food and clothing and medicine. And we're going to send you on your way. I packed my meager belongings up, and just as I'm getting into that wagon, one of the storekeepers rushed up to me, handed me 2 brand new pairs of boots. He said, you're going to need those for traveling. And so off I went. Along the way, I was in encampment after encampment, and when I walked into those encampments, I saw the most dreadful conditions. There were boys just laying out in the open sometimes, sick with everything from measles to scarlet fever, laying in their own filth. The stench in those camps was remarkable. I found soldiers, they'd be out hunting, or they'd purloin somebody's poor cow, and they were butchering these animals right there in the camp, throwing the entrails around, not even disposing of anything. They had no latrines dug. They were just using whatever came along and wherever it happened. As nature called, they were more than willing to leave it behind. First thing I did was to march into the commanding officer. He was not that impressed to see me. I explained who I was and where I was from, and that I had come to bring help and medicine and food and clothing. And so I was given that opportunity to clean things up. I instructed the men that they can't be leaving these entrails just laying about. They've got to bury them outside of the camp for health's sake. They can't have the sick laying there right next to a healthy man, because he's going to be sick. It's going to go through that camp like a wildfire. I had the boys digging latrines that was a distance from where the water source was. This was repeated over and over in those camps. I saw it over and over again. And I did what I could to help my soldiers in Peru. Well, pretty soon word got out. Now, I remind you, I wasn't the only one. Hundreds of ladies in the north and south. We were leaving our homes, leaving our families sometimes. We were reminded of that little lady over there in England. Lady from a wealthy family. Her name was Florence Nightingale. She, you might say, wrote the book on nursing. We followed her instructions to the letter. I trained many of the nurses. I trained them along the way. Pretty soon I would find myself down in Tennessee again. They'd organized a hospital down there. It was along the Tennessee River, so that they could be shipping the sick and wounded fat boys up to the north. It would be the largest of the hospitals, not the field hospitals. I'd served in many of those. But this was to be a hospital where the boys were going to recuperate, gain their health back after they'd been sick or wounded. I don't have to tell you, many of those men never made it out of those hospitals. Died from infection, from shock, from blood loss. But I did everything I could. I established criteria for those nurses to follow that I was training. The one thing I did right off was I told all my nurses that when we were bringing those boys in from the field hospitals, why, we had to do kind of separating the boys out. Nowadays you call it triage. We just call it common sense. Well, that common sense included sorting through the boys. Those we knew had no hope of survival, those who were in desperate condition, and those who could wait for medical help. Well, what my nurses started to do on my instruction was to keep a handful of these here tags. They'd write the boy's name, his regiment, nature of his wounds, and what kind of medicines and what kind of treatment he had been receiving, tied it onto his jacket. That would make it a lot easier when he got to the hospital for the next group of doctors and nurses to know how to treat the boy. As I say, I was not only in the hospitals. During my time in that bloody war, I would be on the battlefield 19 times. I remember after one particular brutal day of battle, I went out toward evening to see who I could pick up and bring back into the camp. I walked among the dead and the dying. Sometimes all you can do is to hold on to them until they've crossed over that cold river. There had been that afternoon, earlier in the day when I was tending to some boys at the edge of the battlefield. Why, this young lieutenant, he was on a magnificent chestnut horse. Oh, he had gay feathers in his hat, and he's waving his saber over his head, and he points to me. He said, "Madam, what right do you have to be on this battlefield? By whose authority?" I pointed overhead. I said, "By his authority. Do you have one higher?" Well, that night as I went out onto that battlefield, I found that young lieutenant. His horse had been shot out from under him. His leg was badly fractured as a result of the horse falling on him. Poor young fellow was in tears when I walked up. I bent down to assess his injuries. He began to weep and he said, "Mother, can you help me? Can you help me, please?" Well, I got that horse off of him. I carried him off that field on my back. I brought him to the hospital. I set his leg, gave him plenty of morphine so he'd go to sleep. As I was walking away, he tugged on my skirt and said, "Thank you, Mother. Thank you for what you've done for me." I remember replying, "No charge." Well, as I say, I've been on many of those battlefields day and night, tending the sick and dying. I can tell you, wasn't welcomed by the brass, as they call it. No, I was nothing more than a troublemaker. You see, on one occasion, when I was visiting one of the hospitals, I was very disappointed as to the quality of the food and the quantity of the food that was brought into the hospital to feed the sick and wounded. And then I would find out that one of the physicians, one of the medical doctors who had sworn an oath to look after his patients, why, he'd been stealing those commodities from the army. And he was selling them on the black market there. And he was lining his pockets. I confronted this gentleman, and I told him what I had found out. He said, "Can you prove it?" I said, "Most assuredly, I would not confront you had I not had the proof in my hand." Well, I wrote to his commanding officer, and he was threatened with dismissal, even court-martial. But he thought he'd outsmart me. He wrote right up to old General Sherman about the situation of sending this woman, this interfering woman who knows it all, coming into his camps and telling him how he should take care of his patients. She had no right to be in that camp so far as he was concerned. And he got an answer from General Sherman. General Sherman apologized for his treatment. But he said, "However, sir, there is nothing I can do, for that lady outranks me." Well, as I say, I was not a favorite of those officers. For it wasn't the officers I was interested in. They had their own physicians. They could have the right medicine. It was my boys, my common, uncommon boys in blue. They're the ones who needed the help. Well, as I was saying, we were shipping those boys north in the flatboats. And sometimes my nurses would lose track. Sometimes a boy who shouldn't have been put on the ship was put on that ship. I recall there was a young boy. I came upon him. His fellows had carried him on a door, placed him there on the deck of the boat going to the hospital. The boy had suffered a gut wound. He was taking up space. I couldn't help this boy. He was no more than 17. I came upon him. I made him as comfortable as I could with some morphine. And he said to me, "Mother, what do you got in that sack?" I replied, "Oh, just a scrap of bread." He asked me, "Mother, is it white bread?" I said, "Yes, son, it is." "Could I have just a bit? Could I have just a bit in my mouth? I ain't tasted no white bread in 3 years." I broke off a bit and I placed it in his mouth. Oh, he lay back his head as though I had placed the manna of heaven in his mouth. He took a breath and he sighed. And the boy was gone. I had seen such suffering. I had seen such suffering in those boys. On another occasion, I was loading up the boys onto the flatboats. I realized I had nothing to give them. I always tried to have some little bit of food or whatever I could find, some scrap to nourish them on the trip north. I had nothing in my hands, but I recalled that I'd passed a peach orchard a while back, and there along the side of the road were 2 bushels of peaches. I had some of my nurses come down with me, and we availed ourselves of those farmers' peaches. And as I picked up the bushel, I looked up and I said, "Dear Lord, I promise that I will be back to pay this farmer for these peaches. I just won't be able to tell you when." Well, we got onto that flatboat, and I went round. I was handing those boys who could tolerate some food. I gave them a peach. There was one young fella. He was sitting on the deck, and he was leaning on the rail. I could see that his left arm had been shattered. I knew that when we got up to the hospital, that arm was going to have to come off. If we didn't take it off, then he was going to die. It seemed to me a reasonable trade, one left arm for a lifetime. Well, I came to the boy. He was pale. His face was drawn. I held out the peach, and I said, "Son, would you like this peach?" Took it in his hand. He said, "Well, Mother, I don't know if I can eat it now, but can I keep it for later on?" And I said, "Yes, it's all yours." He tucked it into the pocket of that tattered blue jacket of his. Well, when we got back up to the hospital, by that time it was important that we got that arm taken away, and he survived. In those days I saw such suffering. I never want to see such suffering again. Well, as I was telling you about this hospital called the Chombosa Hospital there in Tennessee, why, when I got there, it had to be all reorganized. I was named the administrator. Not one of my favorite tasks. But I was named the administrator, and so I had to reorganize everything in the hospital. And one thing I found out very quickly was that we were giving those boys bread that wasn't fit for a cattle to eat, much less a soldier. Now, you may have heard from others that some of these war profiteers were selling rotten, rancid meat to the boys. That's the truth. And the bakers that had been hired, they were getting flour at a very cheap price from the government in order to bake the bread for the hospitals. Well, those bakers, what they were doing was sifting through that flour, making it 75% flour and 25% sawdust to make a big profit for themselves. Well, I knew I wasn't going to fight that system, but if we baked our own bread, if the flour came directly to the hospital and we baked our own bread, we would eventually eliminate that problem. So one day I went into one of the wards where the boys there are pretty much fully recuperated from their wounds or from their illness, and they're given tasks, everything from cleaning up to looking after their fellows in the hospital. Well, I went in there one day, and I said to the boys, "Anybody in here ever lay any brick? Any stonemasons here?" Some hands shot up. One young fellow said, "I was an apprentice out in Philadelphia." Another fellow said, "Oh, I laid brick all over. I laid brick from Boston to New York and back again." Well, I gathered those men up, took them out into a little part we had there at the hospital. You might call it a yard. And we had piles and piles of brick. Buildings had been shelled and had fallen down, and I had many women employed hauling in that brick. And these women sat and cleaned those bricks off. They were happy to have honest work. You see, many of these women, they lived on the streets, selling themselves to get more liquor. But they were happy to be helping there at the hospital. We couldn't pay them much. We gave them room, we gave them board. They did everything from scrubbing the floors to washing the clothes and the bed sheets. And many of them were set to work cleaning those bricks. And pretty soon we built ovens. We built ovens out in that yard, and we were baking our own bread. And we had eliminated that middleman. Our boys were getting healthful, good food. Oh, so many had died for the lack of it. Oh, the suffering that went on in that war. It should never have been tolerated. Another thing I taught my nurses, you know, quite often we were giving those boys morphine or laudanum, various opiates, and nobody made a notation as to how much or when they'd had it. I insisted that my nurses always note everything in their log books, but I also told them, always carry a little bottle of ink with you. When you've given a boy some morphine or laudanum, you just put a little mark on his head so we at least know he's already had something, so we don't give him too much. Well, everything I taught them, and they learned well. They were good nurses. And I think about all the folks from Chicago to St. Louis and New York and on, all those folks, how kind, how generous they were to send things for the boys. Well, all these here crates that you see were filled up there in Chicago or New York or in Boston and sent down to our boys. All due to the generosity of all the folks up north. Oftentimes the boys wanted a bit of special drink, and the ladies would include that too. And they would send medicine in these travel boxes so that the doctors and the nurses might be able to carry all the medicine with them that they needed day to day to treat their patients. But soon, that was coming to an end, that war. Oh, I remember this. Oh, I remember April 7th, 1865. Finally, the war was coming to an end there. Yes, and just a week after that, why, that devil by the name of Mr. Booth would take Father Abraham from us.
Yes.
Now, we've been through the worst. We've been through the worst in this country. We were shattered. We were broken. I never imagined such suffering in North and South. And then there would be the glory days. Sometimes wonder if we really had something to celebrate. I remember riding in that May 5th, it was, of 1865, parade down Pennsylvania Avenue there in Washington City. I rode a beautiful white horse. I rode right next to General Sherman. But what do you do once the fighting is over and the cannons have cooled? Well, I went back to Galesburg, found a little house to rent at the edge of the town, went on with my midwifing, looking after folks. My sons came back. One of them settled there in Galesburg. The other one, why, he decided to go off to a place called the Kansas Territory. Hundreds of folks were settling there when the government opened it up for homesteading. My boy, Willie, why, he settled there in Kansas, a place called Lawrence, Kansas. He asked over and over in his letters, "Ma, come on down here and settle. They need folks like you. They need folks who know medicine to help them out." Yeah. As I say, I looked at myself again and said, "Well, Mary Ann, you've got nothing holding you here in Galesburg." So I went off to the Kansas Territory, and then I became sort of a lawyer when I got down there, an advocate, you might say, for the veterans who had come home from the war. Many of them had nothing left. The farms they once knew were gone. Many of the folks they knew were dead and gone. And I thought if we could settle these folks, if we could settle the folks and their families down there in a new place, a fresh place in the Kansas Territory, that they could have a new start, to put all of that suffering, that horror of that war, they could put it away for good and begin a new life. Well, I settled more than 300 veterans down there in the Kansas Territory. Oh, some of them didn't stay, but most of them did. And while I was down there, they established a hospital there in Lawrence, and they named it after me. Well, I was the administrator of the hospital. Anybody asked my name, I'd say, just look over the doorway and you'll find out. Well, I organized a good hospital down there in Kansas. I was working hard. Still wanted to do my midwifing. Well, you know, I received, now this is from the state of Kansas here, from the State Historical Society in Topeka, at a meeting of the directors of this society held in its rooms on January 18, 1895, I have been unanimously elected as an honorary member. It's sealed there. I was a special member of their historical society for settling there in Kansas. Well, I kept on working every day down there. I was coming up on 84 years. There were times when I rose up in the morning and I said, Mary Ann, what have you been doing for 84 years? Well, that particular morning, I had delivered a set of twins the previous day. And when I got up the next morning, I was so anxious to go back out and see those twin babies and see how Mama was doing. And I bent down to tie my shoe. They said I'd had a stroke. I died that day. Went to meet my Maker. Oh. And then the controversy began. You see, the folks down there in Kansas figured I should be laid to rest in Kansas because I had settled there. The folks in Ohio said I should be laid to rest there because I was born there. The folks in Kentucky said I should stay there because I'd lived there. And the folks in Indiana wanted me because I had lived there. And then the folks in Iowa said that I should pay my debt to Iowa and be laid to rest there. Well, there was some discussion about it. Nobody asked my opinion. Well, finally, the decision came down and I was laid to rest. I was laid to rest there in Galesburg, next to my Billy. Oh, I had a grand funeral. Why, at my funeral, there were generals and colonels and mayors and senators and congressmen, and everyone was there to honor the blessed Mary Ann Bickerdike, Mother Bickerdike. But you know, I think back when I was riding in that grand parade of the Grand Army of the Republic. I remember looking back at that long line of blue coats. And I said to myself, Mary Ann, you had something to do with those men to keep them alive. You had something to be thankful for, that you had the ability, the knowledge to keep those boys alive. Oh, well, that grand funeral, there I lay in that old big pine box. And there was that long line. That long line of blue coats coming by to pay their respects. And then one fella, he came up. He had his tattered blue jacket on. The left arm of the jacket hung free. His face was weathered and tanned like an old boot. He reached into his pocket and he pulled out a peach pit. He laid it upon my chest, and tears were welling up. And he said to me, Mother Bickerdine, thank you. Thank you for all you've done. That was the grandest tribute. Oh, during those years, I had seen the worst of mankind, and I'd seen the best of mankind. But I can say that I did what I had to do. I can say that I did the very best for my fighting boys in blue, those uncommon, common soldiers.